June 1942. The Pacific Ocean is the largest battlefield in human history. It covers 63 million square miles. It is a vast, blue emptiness where fleets can hide for weeks without ever seeing each other. But on the 1st of June, that silence was a lie. Moving through the fog of the North Pacific was the most powerful naval armada ever assembled. For fleet carriers, 2 light carriers, 11 battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines. It was the Imperial Japanese Navy, and it was heading east. Their target was a tiny speck of coral sand called Midway Atoll. The commander-in-chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, had a simple plan. He would attack Midway. He would seize the island. And when the remnants of the American Navy came out to defend it, he would crush them. He would finish what he started at Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto believed he was invincible. He believed the Americans were demoralized, broken, and terrified. He believed that surprise was on his side. He was wrong, because 3,000 miles away, in a humid, windowless basement in Hawaii, a man in a smoking jacket was reading Yamamoto's mail. The Battle of Midway did not begin with a gunshot. It began with a math problem. To understand the miracle of Midway, you have to leave the open ocean and go underground. You have to go to the basement of the administration building at Pearl Harbor, a place officially known as the Combat Intelligence Unit. But the men who worked there called it the dungeon, or simply Station HYPO. It was a miserable place. It had no air conditioning. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of stale coffee. The floor was littered with punch cards and scraps of paper. The only sound was the clattering of IBM tabulating machines and the hum of cooling fans. And in the center of this chaos sat Commander Joseph Rockefort. Rockefort was not your typical naval officer. He didn't care about uniforms or salutes. He often worked 36 hours straight, fueled by caffeine and obsession. He wore carpet slippers because his feet were swollen from standing. He wore a red velvet smoking jacket over his uniform to keep warm in the drafty basement. He looked like a mad scientist, but he was the best codebreaker in the world. 4 months, Rockefort and his team had been listening to the Japanese Naval Code, Jan 25B. It was an incredibly complex cipher. It used 45,000 5-digit numbers to represent words and phrases. And just to make it harder, the Japanese changed the additive keys every few months, turning the code into a completely new language. Washington, D.C. had its own code-breaking unit, OP-20G. The men in Washington were polished, political, and by the book. They hated Rockefort. They called him a cowboy. In May 1942, the radio traffic exploded. The Japanese were planning something huge. Rockefort could see the volume of messages spiking. He saw the movement of captains, the requisition of maps, the loading of torpedoes. He knew a massive operation was coming, but he didn't know where. The Japanese messages kept referring to a target codenamed AF. Target AF. Washington was convinced that AF was the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. Or maybe it was the west coast of the United States. They told Admiral Nimitz to prepare for an attack on San Francisco. Rockefort disagreed. He knew the Japanese mind. He knew their doctrine. He looked at the patterns. AF, he told Nimitz, is Midway. Washington laughed at him. They told Nimitz that Rockefort was guessing. They refused to deploy the fleet based on a hunch from a man in a smoking jacket. Rockefort needed proof. He needed to force the Japanese to reveal themselves. One of his staff officers, Jasper Holmes, came up with an idea. A trick. A trap made of words. Midway Atoll depended on a desalination plant for its drinking water. Holmes suggested that they send a fake radio message from Midway to Pearl Harbor, claiming that the freshwater distiller had broken down. They sent the message in the clear, uncoded. They knew the Japanese listening posts on Wake Island would hear it. It was a gamble. If the Japanese ignored it, Rockefort would look like a fool. 2 days later, a Japanese intercept came into the dungeon. It was a message from the Japanese intelligence unit to the fleet commanders. It read, "Target AF is short on water." The room went silent. Rockefort smiled. The trap had snapped shut. AF was Midway. Rockefort walked out of the basement and went straight to Admiral Nimitz. He slammed the intercept on the desk. He gave Nimitz the date. June 4th. He gave him the location. From the northwest. He gave him the specific course. He effectively handed Nimitz the script of the Japanese attack before it had even been rehearsed. While Rockefort was winning the war of numbers, Admiral Yamamoto was sailing into a war of illusions. Yamamoto was aboard his flagship, the super battleship Yamato. It was the largest warship ever built, a floating fortress with 18-inch guns that could hurl a car-sized shell 20 miles. Yamamoto was a complex man. He had studied at Harvard. He knew America. He had warned the emperor that fighting the US was a mistake. He famously said, "I can run wild for 6 months. After that, I have no expectation of success." But the success of the last 6 months had gone to his head. The Japanese Navy was suffering from what historians call victory disease. They had conquered Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies with terrifying speed. They had never known defeat. They believed they were racially and spiritually superior to the soft, democratic Americans. This arrogance led to a fatal mistake in the battle plan. Yamamoto's plan for Midway was incredibly complicated. It relied on perfect timing and complex choreography. But his biggest mistake was dividing his forces. He sent a carrier force to bomb Dutch Harbor in the Aleutian Islands, near Alaska. He thought this would distract the Americans and draw their fleet north. He assumed the Americans would react after the attack on Midway began. He pictured the U.S. fleet sitting in Pearl Harbor, shocked by the news, scrambling to get their ships ready. He thought he would have days to take the island before the American carriers arrived. He did not know that the Americans were not in Pearl Harbor. He did not know that his radio silence was useless because Rockefort was reading his mail. Yamamoto was sailing into an ambush. He was bringing 4 carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, straight into the crosshairs of a waiting enemy. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, was a man of quiet steel. He looked at the intelligence reports. He looked at the skepticism from Washington. And he made a choice. He trusted the man in the basement. Nimitz decided to go all in. He would strip Pearl Harbor of every available warship and send them to a specific point on the map north of Midway, a place they called Point Luck. But he had a math problem of his own. The Japanese had 4 heavy carriers. Nimitz only had 2 operational carriers, the Enterprise and the Hornet. The third carrier, the USS Yorktown, was a wreck. She had been badly damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea just weeks earlier. A Japanese bomb had pierced her flight deck and exploded deep inside the ship. Her hull was sprung. She was leaking oil. Her internal bulkheads were buckled. When the Yorktown limped into Pearl Harbor on May 27th, she looked like a floating junkyard. The naval inspectors went aboard. They looked at the damage. They shook their heads. They told Nimitz it will take 3 months to repair this ship. 3 months. Nimitz looked at them. He didn't have 3 months. He didn't have 3 weeks. "We must have this ship back in 3 days," he said. It was an impossible order. But what happened next was a miracle of American industrial power. 1,400 welders, shipwrights, and electricians swarmed the Yorktown. They didn't stop to sleep. They didn't stop to eat. They worked around the clock in 100-degree heat inside the twisted metal of the ship. The lights of the welding torches turned the night into day at the Pearl Harbor dry dock. The sound of hammering was deafening. They patched the flight deck with steel plates. They shored up the bulkheads with massive timber beams. They fixed the elevators. They didn't fix everything. The ship still wasn't watertight. The radar was glitchy, but she could sail, and she could fight. On the morning of May 30th, just 72 hours after arriving, the USS Yorktown began to move. As she slid out of the harbor, hundreds of workmen were still on board, finishing the repairs as she sailed to war. Nimitz now had 3 carriers. It was still 3 against 4. But he had the element of surprise. The trap was set. The Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown sailed under strict radio silence. They disappeared into the vast emptiness of the Pacific. They moved to the coordinates provided by Joseph Rockefort. They waited. On the night of June 3rd, the two fleets were closing in on each other. On the Japanese ships, the pilots were writing letters home, confident of another easy victory. They drank sake and toasted the emperor. They had no idea that just over the horizon, 3 American carriers were lying in wait, their decks packed with dauntless dive bombers and Wildcat fighters. The stage was set. The intelligence war was over. The shooting war was about to begin. Yamamoto had brought the might of an empire to crush a small island. But he had forgotten the most important rule of warfare. If you don't know where the enemy is, you are not the hunter. You are the prey. The sun began to rise on June 4th, 1942. It was a beautiful, clear morning. The water was calm, and 5 minutes that would change the world were ticking down. June 4th, 1942. 4:30 in the morning. The Pacific Ocean was pitch black. The water was smooth as glass. 200 miles northwest of Midway, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy began to wake up. This was the codebreakers, the mobile force. It was the most powerful naval strike force on the planet. For massive aircraft carriers, the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, and the Hiryu sailed in a perfect box formation. On the flight decks, the engines of 108 warplanes roared to life. The blue exhaust flames flickered in the darkness. The smell of high-octane aviation fuel and salt spray filled the air. Admiral Nagumo stood on the bridge of the flagship Akagi. He watched as the first Zero fighter rolled down the wooden deck and lifted into the night sky. Nagumo was a traditionalist. He was a torpedo man, not an aviator. He was cautious. He felt the weight of the empire on his shoulders. He had been given a specific order by Yamamoto: neutralize Midway. He watched as the first wave of bombers formed up and headed southeast toward the island. But as the planes disappeared into the dawn, a small mechanical failure was happening on a cruiser miles away, a failure that would ultimately doom the entire fleet. To protect the carriers, the Japanese cruisers were supposed to launch scout planes to search the ocean for enemy ships. It was a routine precaution. On the cruiser Tone, the catapult for scout plane number 4 malfunctioned. The pilot sat in his cockpit, engine idling, frustrated. The mechanics hammered at the release gear. They cursed the equipment. Took them 30 minutes to fix it. 30 minutes. In the grand scheme of a world war, 30 minutes seems like nothing. But in the Battle of Midway, time was the only thing that mattered. Because of that delay, Scout number 4 launched late. Instead of searching the sector where the American fleet was hiding, it was flying into empty ocean. The Japanese fleet was now blind. And they didn't even know it. 6:20 in the morning. The Japanese strike force arrived over Midway. The American defenders were waiting. The Marines on the ground put up a wall of anti-aircraft fire. The obsolete Buffalo fighters flown by the Americans were swatted out of the sky by the superior Japanese Zeros. The Japanese bombers pounded the hangars, the oil tanks, and the gun batteries. Smoke rose thousands of feet into the air. But the runway at Midway was still usable. The American bombers had already left. The Japanese flight leader, Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, looked down at the burning island. He realized they hadn't done enough. The job wasn't finished. He clicked his radio and sent a message back to the fleet. A message that would trigger a cascade of fatal decisions. He said, "There is need for a second attack." On the bridge of the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo received the message. He had a problem. His flight decks were full of his second wave. These were his reserve planes, and they were armed with torpedoes. These torpedoes were designed to sink battleships. They were meant for the American fleet in case it showed up. But the scout planes had reported nothing. The ocean was empty. Nagumo had to make a choice. Should he keep his reserve planes armed with torpedoes, waiting for a phantom enemy? Or should he switch them to high-explosive bombs to finish off Midway? He looked at the clock. He looked at the empty horizon. He gave the order. Rearm the planes. Take off the torpedoes. Load the land bombs. Down in the hangars of the 4 carriers, hell broke loose. The mechanics were already exhausted. Now they had to rush. You have to understand the physical reality of this order. An aerial torpedo weighs nearly 2,000 pounds. It is not something you just swap out like a light bulb. The crews had to use heavy hoists and trolleys. They had to unbolt the torpedoes from the bellies of the cates. They had to lower them onto carts. Then they had to haul the massive 800-kilogram bombs over to the planes and winch them up. The hangars were hot, noisy, and chaotic. Men were shouting. Metal clanged against metal. They worked as fast as they could. They were halfway through the job when the universe played its cruelest trick. 7:40 in the morning. The radio officer on the Akagi handed a note to Nagumo. His face was pale. It was a message from Scout Plane Number 4, the late plane from the cruiser Tone. The pilot had finally reached the end of his patrol. He looked down through a break in the clouds, and he saw something that shouldn't have been there. The message read, "Sighted 10 enemy surface ships." Nagumo froze. Ships? What kind of ships? He barked an order to the radio room. Ask him what type of ships. The minutes ticked by, agonizingly slow. The scout plane didn't answer immediately. Nagumo paced the bridge. If those were battleships, he was fine. But if there was a carrier, then his planes were currently armed with the wrong weapons. You cannot sink a carrier with a land bomb. You need torpedoes. At 8:20, the scout plane finally confirmed the nightmare. Enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. The blood drained from Nagumo's face. Carrier. That meant American dive bombers were already in the air. That meant they were coming for him. Panic began to set in. Nagumo canceled his previous order. Stop loading bombs. Put the torpedoes back on. Down in the hangars, the mechanics were on the verge of collapse. They had just spent an hour taking the torpedoes off. Now they were told to put them back on. In the rush, discipline broke down. Normally, when you remove a bomb from a plane, you take it down to the secure magazine at the bottom of the ship. You lock it away safely behind blast doors. But there was no time. The Americans were coming. So the mechanics did the only thing they could do. They simply lowered the high-explosive bombs onto the hangar deck and pushed them to the side. They stacked them against the walls. They left them sitting on the trolleys. The hangar decks of the Akagi and the Kaga became littered with piles of unsecured ordnance. Hundreds of thousands of pounds of high explosives were sitting out in the open, right next to the fuel lines, right next to the fueling aircraft. The ships had turned themselves into floating powder kegs. All they needed was a single spark. And high above the clouds, that spark was already on its way. Nagumo looked out at the horizon. He was desperate to launch his strike force. But he couldn't. His flight decks were busy recovering the planes returning from Midway. He had to land them, refuel them, and move them out of the way before he could bring his attack planes up from the hangar. He was caught in a traffic jam of his own making. He had no combat air patrol protecting him. His decks were fouled. His hangars were full of bombs. And his enemy knew exactly where he was. The fog of confusion had blinded the Japanese Empire. And out of that fog, the sound of engines began to descend. Not the engines of Zeros, but the engines of American devastators. The slaughter was about to begin. 9:20 in the morning. The sky above the Pacific was broken by clouds. Searching through the haze were the American strike groups from the Hornet, the Enterprise, and the Yorktown. But they were not a unified force. In the rush to launch, the squadrons had become separated. The fighters, the dive bombers, and the torpedo planes were scattered across miles of ocean, lost in the clouds, running low on fuel, searching for a moving target. One man, however, knew exactly where he was going. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron was the leader of Torpedo Squadron 8, flying off the Hornet. He was a part Native American from South Dakota, a man of intense, almost mystical intuition. Before the takeoff, he had argued with his superiors about the Japanese course. He told them, "I know where they are." Now, in the air, he broke formation. He led his squadron of 15 planes away from the main group. He banked his wings and headed southwest, following his gut. He was right. At 9:25, the clouds parted. And there, spread out on the blue water, was the entire Japanese mobile force. It was a terrifying sight. Four massive aircraft carriers surrounded by a ring of battleships and cruisers, a fortress of steel. Waldron looked at his fuel gauge. He looked at his squadron. They were flying the TBD Devastator. It was a plane that lived up to the wrong half of its name. It was devastatingly bad. It was slow, lumbering, and obsolete. To launch a torpedo, it had to fly straight and level at barely 100 miles per hour. It was a sitting duck. Worse, Waldron had no fighter cover. The Wildcat fighters that were supposed to protect him had lost contact. He was alone. 15 slow planes against the most powerful fleet in the world. He could have turned back. He could have waited for help. Instead, he picked up his microphone. He spoke to his men. His voice was calm. Request permission to withdraw from action. Negative. We will attack. We will go in. He pushed the throttle forward and dropped down to the water. This was not a battle. It was a charge of the Light Brigade at 20 feet above the waves. On the Japanese carriers, the lookouts screamed, "Enemy torpedo planes." High above, the Japanese Combat Air Patrol reacted instantly. These were the elite Zero pilots. They were the samurais of the sky. They saw the lumbering American planes down low. They tipped their wings and dove. Scores of Zeros swarmed down from 20,000 feet. They fell upon Torpedo 8 like wolves on a flock of sheep. The air filled with the chatter of 20mm cannons. The massacre began. Waldron's plane was the first to be hit. His gas tank erupted in flames. Survivors later said they saw him stand up in the burning cockpit, trying to escape, before the plane hit the water and disintegrated. One by one, the Devastators were smashed out of the sky. They didn't stand a chance. The Zeros slashed at them from all sides. The anti-aircraft guns from the ships threw up a wall of water and steel. The Americans kept coming. They held their course. They tried to line up their shots. But the Japanese ships simply turned away, easily outmaneuvering the slow torpedoes. Ensign George Gay was the pilot of the last plane in the formation. He watched his friends die in front of him. He watched the planes cartwheel into the sea. He watched the black smoke mark their graves. He was the only one left. He pressed on. He got close enough to the carrier Kaga to drop his torpedo. He pulled up, skimming the flight deck so close he could see the faces of the Japanese sailors. A second later, 5 Zeros jumped him. His rear gunner was dead. His engine was shot to pieces. His plane crashed into the ocean. Gay managed to crawl out of the wreckage. He hid under a floating seat cushion, bobbing in the water. He was the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8. Out of 30 men, 29 were dead. Out of 15 planes, 0 returned. And they hadn't scored a single hit. But the sacrifice of Torpedo 8 was not the end. It was only the beginning. Because just as the Japanese finished wiping out Waldron's squadron, another group appeared. Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise. They too came in low. They too had no fighter cover. They too were slaughtered. 10 out of 14 planes were shot down. And then Torpedo Squadron 3 from the Yorktown. 12 planes. 10 shot down. It seemed like a senseless waste of life. Wave after wave of brave young men flying into a meat grinder, achieving absolutely nothing. The Japanese sailors on the decks cheered. They pumped their fists. They thought they were invincible. They had wiped out the American attacks with ease. But they didn't realize what had actually happened. Admiral Nagumo and his Zero pilots had fallen into a tactical trap. A trap created by their own success. By swarming down to sea level to kill the torpedo bombers, the Japanese fighters had abandoned the sky. The entire Combat Air Patrol, nearly 50 Zeros, was now flying at wavetop height. They were busy chasing the last few survivors of the torpedo squadrons. They were weaving through the smoke of the anti-aircraft fire. Their attention was focused entirely downward. Their eyes were locked on the water. More importantly, their guns were empty. They had spent their ammunition killing the Devastators. They needed to land and rearm. And they were low on fuel. The Japanese carriers were in chaos. They were frantically maneuvering to avoid the torpedoes, turning in tight circles. This meant they couldn't launch their own strike planes. The flight decks were still cluttered with fully fueled aircraft and loose bombs. For 45 minutes, the Japanese fleet had been looking down. No one looked up. If they had, they would have seen the emptiness. The high altitude, 20,000 feet above the fleet, was completely undefended. There were no Zeros patrolling the clouds. The ceiling was wide open. The sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons had drawn the guards away from the gate. John Waldron and his men had not died in vain. They had bought time with their blood. They had pulled the Japanese eyes down to the water, leaving the heart of the fleet exposed. It was now 10:20 in the morning. The guns on the ships fell silent for a moment. The last torpedo bomber had been splashed. The Japanese commanders took a breath. They thought the danger was over. They began to turn their ships back into the wind to launch their own counterattack. They were 5 minutes away from victory. But then, a lookout on the carrier Kaga tilted his head back. He saw a glint of silver in the sun. He saw a black dot, then another, then dozens. He screamed a warning that came too late. Helldivers! From the high heavens, the retribution was falling. 10 o'clock in the morning. High above the slaughter taking place on the surface, the sky was a brilliant, empty blue. At 20,000 feet, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey was a man running out of time. McCluskey was the air group commander of the USS Enterprise. He was leading 32 SBD Dauntless dive bombers. They were the tip of the American spear. But the spear was about to break. McCluskey had been searching for the Japanese fleet for hours. He had flown to the predicted intercept point, but the ocean was empty. The Japanese had turned north, away from where intelligence said they would be. Now McCluskey was staring at his fuel gauge. The needle was bouncing near empty. His wingmen were signaling him anxiously. They were burning precious gas with every second. The logical military decision was to turn back. If they stayed any longer, they wouldn't have enough fuel to reach the Enterprise. They would have to ditch in the ocean. McCluskey had to make a choice. Turn back and save his men, or keep flying into the unknown and risk losing everyone. He decided to push on. Just 5 more minutes. At 10:55, he looked down at the vast, featureless water. And he saw something. It wasn't a carrier. It was a single, small white line cutting through the blue. Awake! It was the Japanese destroyer Arisher. Earlier that morning, the Arisher had stayed behind to drop depth charges on an American submarine, the USS Nautilus. Now, the destroyer was rushing at top speed to rejoin the main fleet. McCluskey didn't know the ship's name, but he knew what that wake meant. It was a breadcrumb, an arrow painted on the ocean floor pointing the way to the target. McCluskey banked his wing. He signaled his squadron. Follow that ship. 10:20 a.m. McCluskey looked toward the horizon. Through a gap in the broken clouds, he saw them. The Kido Butai. It was a sight that no American pilot had ever seen before. The 4 great carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were operating in a loose diamond formation. They were surrounded by battleships and cruisers firing their guns at the low-level torpedo planes. To McCluskey, it looked like a model set. The ships were tiny toys floating in a bathtub. But as he looked closer, he realized something that made his heart stop. The Japanese skies were empty. There were no Zero fighters at 20,000 feet. There was no combat air patrol. The Zeros had all been drawn down to the deck to kill the torpedo bombers. They were buzzing around the ships like angry wasps, completely unaware that death was hanging over their heads. And the decks of the carriers were full. McCluskey could see the bright red circles, the Hinomaru, painted on the yellow wooden flight decks. And parked right on top of those rising suns were rows and rows of aircraft. The Japanese were in the middle of the frantic rearming operation. The decks were cluttered with fuel hoses. Carts piled high with high-explosive bombs and torpedoes were scattered everywhere. The mechanics were running back and forth. It was a target-rich environment. It was a powder keg waiting for a match. And the Americans had brought a torch. By a stroke of incredible luck, or perhaps destiny, McCluskey was not alone. At almost the exact same moment, another group of bombers arrived from the east. It was Maxwell Leslie and the Bombing Squadron 3 from the USS Yorktown. They had arrived at the same second, from different directions, completely by accident. It was a perfectly coordinated hammer and anvil attack, orchestrated by chance. The Japanese lookouts were still watching the water, cheering as the last American torpedo plane splashed into the sea. Then someone looked up. The scream of the first engine pierced the air. The dive, 10:22 a.m. Wade McCluskey tapped his head and signaled the attack. The SBD Dauntless is a specific kind of machine. It is designed to fall out of the sky. The pilot pulls a lever, and the split flaps on the wings open up like a cheese grater. These are the dive brakes. They slow the plane down so it doesn't rip its wings off as it plunges toward the earth. McCluskey rolled his plane upside down. The horizon flipped. The blue ocean filled his windshield. He pulled back on the stick and entered a 70-degree dive. Gravity takes over. The pilot is pressed forward against his straps. The altimeter unwinds like a clock in fast forward. 20,000 feet. 15,000. 10,000. The sound is terrifying. The wind screams through the perforated dive brakes, creating a banshee wail that can be heard for miles. McCluskey led his squadron down. But in the adrenaline of the moment, a mistake happened. A mistake that almost ruined the attack but ended up saving it. According to doctrine, McCluskey should have taken the far carrier, the Akagi, while his wingman took the near carrier, the Kaga. But McCluskey dove on the Kaga. Behind him, Lieutenant Richard Best, leading the second section, saw the air group commander diving on the wrong target. Best watched in horror as almost all the planes from the Enterprise poured down onto the Kaga. If everyone bombed the Kaga, the flagship Akagi would escape. Dick Best made a split-second decision. He pulled back on his stick. He fought the G-forces and aborted his dive. He signaled his two wingmen to stay with him. 3 planes. Just 3. Against the flagship of the Japanese Navy. Best banked his plane and lined up on the Akagi. Below them, the Japanese sailors froze. They looked up into the sun and saw the silver wings flashing. The shout went up. Dive bombers! Dive bombers! But it was too late. The physics of the situation were absolute. A bomb dropped from 2,000 feet takes only a few seconds to arrive. The Kaga, the first carrier to die, was the Kaga. She was a massive ship, a converted battleship hull. And she was about to be erased from existence. The planes from McCluskey's squadron roared down. The Japanese anti-aircraft gunners tried to traverse their weapons, but they were too slow. The first bomb missed, exploding in the water close aboard. The second bomb did not miss. It smashed through the flight deck near the rear elevator. Then the third, the fourth, the fifth. The Kaga was hit by at least 4 1,000-pound bombs. But it wasn't just the American bombs that did the damage. It was what they hit. One bomb landed directly in the middle of the fully fueled Kates parked on the deck. The aviation fuel vaporized instantly. A massive fireball, hundreds of feet high, engulfed the island structure. The bridge, where the captain and the senior officers were standing, was simply incinerated. Everyone on the bridge was killed instantly. Another bomb penetrated deep into the hangar deck. Remember the loose bombs? Remember the torpedoes stacked against the walls? The American bomb set off a chain reaction. The Japanese ordnance began to cook off. Secondary explosions ripped the ship apart from the inside out. The flight deck plates were blown into the air like playing cards. The sides of the hangar blew out, venting flames into the sea. In 30 seconds, the Kaga ceased to be a warship and became a drifting furnace. The Akagi a mile away, Admiral Nagumo on the Akagi looked in horror at the burning Kaga. He didn't realize that he was next. High above, Richard Best was in his dive. He was looking through his telescopic sight. The yellow flight deck of the Akagi was rushing up at him. He could see the big red circle. He was aiming for the sweet spot, the midship elevator. Best was calm. He held his breath. He waited until he was just 1,500 feet above the deck. That is point-blank range for a dive bomber. He released his bomb. He pulled back on the stick, grunting as the G-forces slammed him into his seat. He skimmed away just above the masts. The first bomb from his wingman missed, splashing into the water and jamming the Akagi's rudder. The second bomb missed by just 20 feet, blowing a hole in the hull. But Richard Best's bomb was perfect. It is known in naval history as the Golden BB. 1 shot, 1 kill. The 1,000-pound bomb punched through the flight deck right behind the midship elevator, crashed down into the hangar deck. The Akagi's hangar was packed with torpedo planes. They were fully fueled, and next to them were the piles of high-explosive land bombs that had been taken off earlier. The fuse on Best's bomb triggered. The explosion was apocalyptic. It didn't just break the ship, it shattered the ship's nervous system. The blast wave ignited the gasoline fumes. It detonated the stockpiled bombs. The blast blew the heavy elevator floor straight up into the air. It twisted the steel flight deck into a pretzel. On the bridge, Admiral Nagumo was thrown to the floor. When he stood up, he looked out the window. The world below him was on fire. The fires on the Akagi were so intense that they melted the steel. The anti-aircraft guns stopped firing because the heat was cooking the ammunition in the magazines. Sailors were jumping into the sea to escape the flames. The flagship of the WWII, the pride of Yamamoto, had been destroyed by a single bomb. The Soryu to the east, the carrier Soryu, was suffering the same fate. Max Leslie and the Yorktown bombers had arrived perfectly. They didn't make mistakes. They divided their targets professionally. They pushed over into their dives. The sun was behind them, blinding the Japanese gunners. They hit the Soryu with 3 heavy bombs. 1 punch, 2 punch, 3 punch. The first bomb hit the forward deck. The second hit the middle. The third hit the rear. It was a systematic execution. The Soryu was lighter and faster than the other carriers, but she had no armor. The bombs tore her open. The exact same nightmare scenario played out. The fueled planes exploded. The loose weapons detonated. The captain of the Soryu, Captain Yamamoto, was standing on the bridge. He was surrounded by flames. His officers tried to drag him away to safety. He refused to leave. He stood there, holding his sword, shouting banzai as his ship burned around him. The result: it was 10:25 a.m. 5 minutes had passed since Wade McCluskey tipped his wing. Just 300 seconds. In the time it takes to boil an egg, the balance of power in the Pacific Ocean had shifted forever. At 10:20, the Imperial Japanese Navy was the most powerful force on Earth. They were winning the war. They were invincible. At 10:25, they were broken. 3 of their 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were burning wrecks, drifting in circles, vomiting black smoke into the beautiful blue sky. Thousands of sailors were dead or dying. Hundreds of aircraft were destroyed. The cream of the Japanese aviators, the men who had trained for a decade, were lost. On the bridge of the burning Akagi, Admiral Nagumo stood in shock. Tears streamed down his face. He could not comprehend what had just happened. He had held victory in his hands, and in 5 minutes it had turned to ash. The roar of the American planes faded away as they turned back toward their ships. The sky was quiet again, but the silence was different now. It was the silence of a graveyard. Only one Japanese carrier remained operational, the Hiryu. She was miles away, hidden in a rain squall. Her captain watched the smoke rising from his sister ships. He knew that the battle was lost. But the samurai code does not allow for surrender. The Hiryu turned into the wind. She launched her planes. The Americans had struck the blow. Now, the Japanese would try to strike back. The battle wasn't over, but the war had just been decided. Noon, June 4th, 1942. The ocean was littered with burning ships, but the battle was not over. One Japanese carrier was still alive, the Hiryu. Her commander was Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi. He was a brilliant, aggressive officer. Many in the Imperial Navy believed he was the only man capable of replacing Yamamoto. Yamaguchi watched the smoke rising from his 3 sister ships. He knew the situation was catastrophic. But he was a samurai. He would not run. He radioed a message to the rest of the fleet. It was a single sentence of cold defiance. "I am now attacking the enemy." The Hiryu turned into the wind. Her flight deck was small, but her pilots were elite. She launched a desperate counterstrike. 18 dive bombers and 10 fighters. They followed the returning American planes back toward their fleet. They found the USS Yorktown. The Japanese pilots were vengeful. They dove through a wall of anti-aircraft fire. They hit the Yorktown with 3 bombs. One of them went down the smokestack and blew out the boilers. The Yorktown slowed to a stop. She was dead in the water. But the American damage control teams were miracle workers. They patched the flight deck. They got the boilers running again. In an hour, the Yorktown was moving. So Yamaguchi sent a second wave. Torpedo planes. They hit the Yorktown again. 2 torpedoes ripped into her side. The great ship listed heavily to port. The order was given to abandon ship. Yamaguchi had drawn blood. He had crippled an American carrier. He believed he had evened the score. He prepared to launch a third wave at dusk. He planned to find the other American carriers and destroy them in a night battle. But he never got the chance. The Americans had found him first. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the scouts from the Enterprise spotted the Hiryu. They didn't wait. A swarm of American dive bombers, including many who had already flown that morning, took off again. They were exhausted. They were running on adrenaline. But they wanted to finish the job. They arrived over the Hiryu just as the sun was beginning to set. The Japanese carrier was alone. She twisted and turned, trying to dodge the inevitable. 4 bombs hit her in quick succession. The explosion blew the forward elevator completely out of its shaft. It landed on the bridge, blocking the view. The flight deck collapsed. The fires began to consume the ship. The rising sun had set. The captain's choice midnight. The Hiryu was a burning wreck. She was listing 15 degrees. The engines were dead. On the bridge, Admiral Yamaguchi and the ship's captain, Tomio Kaku, looked out at the destruction. A destroyer pulled alongside to take off the surviving crew. The sailors scrambled down the ropes, coughing in the smoke. But Yamaguchi did not move toward the ropes. He called his staff officers together. He poured a toast of water. There was no sake left. He handed his cap to one of his subordinates as a keepsake. He said, "I have no words to apologize for what has happened. I will remain with the ship." It was the ultimate act of accountability. In the Western world, a commander lives to fight another day. In the Imperial Japanese Navy, failure required atonement. Yamaguchi knew that losing 4 carriers was a death sentence for the Empire. He chose to pay the price himself. Captain Kaku chose to stay with him. The 2 men tied themselves to the bridge structure so their bodies would not float away. They stood together in the darkness as the fires raged closer. At 5 a.m. the next morning, Japanese destroyers fired torpedoes into the Hiryu to scuttle her. She sank into the deep water of the Pacific, taking Japan's best admiral down with her. The silence hundreds of miles away, on the battleship Yamato, Admiral Yamamoto sat in his cabin. He had spent the day waiting for a victory that never came. When the news of the 4 lost carriers finally reached him, he reportedly groaned aloud. His staff urged him to turn the battleships around and bombard Midway at night. They wanted to fight a surface action. But Yamamoto knew it was over. Without air cover, his massive battleships were just targets. If the sun rose and the American planes found him, the Yamato would join the Akagi at the bottom of the sea. He gave the order that broke his heart. Reverse course. Retreat. The Great Armada turned around and steamed back toward Japan in silence. But the silence was not just on the radio. It was a silence of truth. When the survivors returned to Japan, they were not treated as heroes. They were treated as prisoners. The wounded sailors were brought ashore at night in secret. They were isolated in hospital wards surrounded by barbed wire. They were forbidden to speak to their families. They were forbidden to mention the word Midway. The Japanese government lied to its people. The radio announced a great victory. They claimed that the American fleet had been destroyed. They admitted to losing only 1 carrier, while claiming to have sunk 2 American carriers. The citizens of Tokyo celebrated in the streets with lantern parades. They cheered for a victory that was actually a funeral. But the high command knew the truth. The Kido Butai was gone. The veteran pilots were dead. The offensive power of the Imperial Navy had been snapped in half. Before June 4, 1942, the Japanese Navy was unstoppable. They dictated where and when the battles would be fought. After June 4th, they never won another major offensive. For the next 3 years, they would retreat. From island to island. From bloody beach to bloody beach. Until the war ended in the atomic fire of 1945. Historians often debate the turning points of history, but rarely is a turning point so sharp and so fast. At 10:20 a.m., Japan was winning the war. At 10:25 a.m., they were losing it. Those 5 minutes changed the fate of the Pacific. They changed the map of the world. And it all happened because a codebreaker in a basement laid a trap, and an admiral on a bridge blinked at the wrong moment. The warning was ignored, and the price was paid in fire. This was the Battle of Midway, the day the ocean burned.